スザク、僕はブリタニアをぶっ壊す。
When it comes to modern fiction, there's a reason that overly idealistic sentiments such as, I want everyone to love each other, or I want world peace, tend to come out of the mouths of the naive, or more importantly, the young. When corruption is rife and things are going badly in the world, the ones that resolve to change it tend to be the youth, uttering words that mean well, but demonstrate a lack of true life experience. The older generations may have had similar ambitions when they were young, but as soon as a person matures and gains a broad awareness of how the world works, realism sets in, and those initial goals tend to fade away. Because they have long since decided that such dreams are virtually pointless, and have no place in the world if you intend to live a happy life because of the huge boundary that blocks global revolution. It's not that changing the world is impossible, it's that changing the world is only possible through great sacrifice, pain, and suffering. Tangible societal change cannot happen without destruction. By and large, a new world cannot be molded from the current one if its core is rotten. Any given system of power, corrupt or otherwise, did not get there overnight. There are many layers to bodies of power, and there is structure in place that must be overthrown. Society must be pulled up from the roots by those that don't just talk the talk, but truly intend to do something. Yet because of the nature of revolution, the personal and grand repercussions on the path to influencing the world can be so consuming that losing oneself is a true possibility. And with this new framework, seemingly commonplace questions are given new stakes and meaning. What is true conviction? When someone becomes engulfed in darkness, is there really such thing as true redemption? What is the value of morality in smaller situations relative to the end results of the bigger picture? How far can utilitarianism go, and at what point do our biases blind our self-awareness to the point where we completely lose our way? Despite the bombastic mech fights and school hijinks, Code Geass is an anime that hones in on its themes, ideologies, and characters, rather than set pieces or gimmicks. While there are some very valid criticisms that can be directed to the narrative, the show does tackle some very interesting concepts in an effective way. Just a quick disclaimer, I'm not the biggest fan of Code Geass. Unlike most of the stories that I cover in my videos, this isn't a series that I consider to be great or a favorite of mine. While I did enjoy it and my impression of it is comfortably positive, there were quite a few aspects of the show that dragged the experience down for me. I know that some people consider the sole fact that I make analysis videos on certain shows to indicate that I automatically recommend or adore the show, but that is not the case here. As a result, I felt the need to mention this for the sake of honesty and transparency. However, while I don't think that the show is amazing overall, it does have some great aspects. And one of these is the dynamic between Lelouch v Britannia and Suzaku Kururugi. The narrative's most prominent relationship is quite an accomplishment in terms of theming and development. The dynamic between the two main characters and the characterization of each is what I consider to be the show's biggest strength, consistently driving the plot forward, providing some of the story's most emotionally charged moments, and tying everything together nicely by the end. The intertwining character journeys of Lelouch and Suzaku are terrific, displaying a couple of men with identical intentions whose life experiences and contrasts in personality made them go about those intentions in opposing ways. It's a story of two flawed individuals whose ambition constantly threatens to get the better of them, and how their actions change the world on a grand scale. However, the intrigue in their dynamic comes not from the fact that they changed the world, but from the way that they themselves changed on a path to a goal that could not have been achieved without sacrifice and suffering. Lelouch can be summed up with one word: conviction. His resolve is admirable, and his overcoming of nearly insurmountable odds due to sheer dedication is inspiring. Along the way, he wavers, he screws up, and he does terrible things, but this is a big part of what makes him shine. He's not a wish fulfillment protagonist because of how treacherous his path is, but his arc is one that is resonant because of how flawed he is. He's not a power fantasy, but his ability to stick it out until the end and achieve his goal is truly empowering. And in my opinion, flawed as he is undoubtedly the hero of the story, despite being a villain to his world at large. Originally Britannian royalty and heir to the throne, Lelouch's childhood was very difficult. His mother was killed in a conflict with the warring nation of Japan, and his sister, Nunnally, was blinded. Traumatized and infuriated by his father's preoccupation with selfish goals and his inability to protect his mother, Lelouch cut himself off from the man by renouncing his claim to the throne. Due to this, the Empire exiled him and Nunnally to Japan, where they were kept as political hostages and first acquainted with Suzaku, whose family took them in. After feeling betrayed and witnessing the dismissive, cold nature of the vast majority of those involved in politics, Lelouch begins festering a burning hatred for Britannia. Many seem to mistake this lust for revenge for childish one-dimensionality, but that is not all there is to Lelouch's motivations. For him, it's not just a personal quest to overthrow Britannia for revenge. After coming to understand how brutal and broken society is, he genuinely hopes for a better place for Nunnally to live, and eventually he desires the same for the rest of the world. And due to this, he starkly disagrees with Britannia's rule and philosophy.
そうして勝ち残った最も優秀な人間が次の皇帝になるのだから。そうだ。弱者は全て失い這いつくばれ。ブリタニアってのはそういう国だ。そういう世界だ。弱肉強食は原初のルールだ。だとしたら、ナナリーはどうなる？弱いから諦めなくてはならないのか。俺だけは絶対に認めない。
Prior to obtaining his Geass, Lelouch lived his life in meandering monotony. His intellect and tactical mind made him a great candidate to lead a rebellion, but the constraints of society made this very difficult. The story establishes that Lelouch wanted the world to change, but had accepted that it was unlikely to happen, despite his claims that it was always part of the plan. His intelligence and apathetic outlook made school a chore, and though he cared for his friends, his interactions with them were characterized by a sense of resigned loneliness. He interacted with them and enjoyed his time, but it was almost as if he lived in a different emotional universe altogether. As he says himself, his life prior to meeting C2 was a slow death. It was defined by this distinct emptiness as a result of his inability to carry out his ambitions, and this is partly why he has so much dedication to his goal. When he gets his Geass, his potential is unlocked. He's been given a gift, and he has no intention of wasting it, no matter how far he has to go. As pointed out in Sam Lasky's analysis, link in the description, ironically, through a power that allows him to oppress others and dictate their actions, he desires to oppose an empire that he hates partly because it opposes and dictates the actions of others itself. Lelouch is completely aware of this hypocrisy as well, and it doesn't sit well with him, but it's what needs to be done. Lelouch's path to eliminating Britannia left a lot of bodies in its wake, and this causes plenty of internal conflict. The deeper he went and the bigger the collateral damage got, the more torn he became. The further he goes and the closer he gets to eliminating Britannia, the more obvious it is that his initial goal and its value seem to be getting burdened by bloodshed and corpses from his choices. In comparison to his starting point, his dark actions and choices give off the impression that Lelouch has become corrupted by power, like Light Yagami. But a huge distinction between these two characters is that Lelouch is all too aware that he is doing terrible things, and this pains him. And coinciding with this is a significant shift in Lelouch's motivations. While he initially just wanted to make the world a better place for Nunnally, all of the brutality that he witnessed made him realize that this world was in worse shape than he could have imagined, and this slowly causes an alteration in motive for him. He starts wanting peace, not just for his sister, but for the entire world. Lelouch is a self-proclaimed utilitarian, believing in the classic philosophy that the ends justify the means. But there is important nuance to his brand of utilitarianism. Firstly, Lelouch is hypocritical in his mindset. He is grudgingly willing to cause death and sacrifice to reach the finishing line, but the minute that the repercussions of his actions affect someone close to him, he gets extremely upset and loses composure. In fact, issues of personal significance in general put Lelouch on edge. Prior to his shift in motivation, a substantial portion of the story had Lelouch focused on his rage towards his father, rather than what he proclaimed to be his goal. It's not like he didn't want peace, but his hubris and anger took over at times, and pushed his more honorable goals to the back of his mind. Not that this is wrong or even abnormal, quite the contrary. Little personal flaws like this make Lelouch all the more believable. But a more important aspect of his methods relates once again to his self-awareness. By the end, he knows that he is doing terrible things. He does not try to ask for forgiveness or make excuses, and he is willing to bear the full burden of his actions on his own. This distinction ends up being one of Lelouch's most significant character traits. Yet Lelouch isn't primarily characterized by this ruthless pragmatism personality-wise. In fact, the essence of his true self is difficult to place. Throughout his journey, he has had to learn to adapt to situations as best as he could to progress, so his interactions are rarely genuine. His story is a story of masks. He isn't entirely the cold, charismatic, and cruel Zero, and he isn't entirely the soft, kind mask he puts on for his friends. He is somewhere in between, and he shifts masks accordingly. In almost every waking moment of his life, he must be exaggerating or fabricating his persona to maintain his progress, so he can hardly ever relax. His true self is likely the one that he shows to C2, and the way that he acts when he's alone with her, because he cannot hide anything from her. When Lelouch is with C2, he has no need to deceive, and he acts more real than when he is with anyone else, even Nunnally. What's significant here is the nature of his masks. It's often postulated that Lelouch's school persona and his Zero persona are completely different entities, and that his true self is one of the two, with the other one being a completely false persona, but I believe the answer to be a bit more nuanced than that. These two personas are exaggerated extensions of different parts of his personality. Deep down, Lelouch has elements of both masks as essential parts of his psyche. His compassion, love, need for human connection, and desire for peace make up the root of his school persona, and his pragmatism, coldness, logic, and amoral lack of inhibition make up his Zero persona. Of course, there is more to his personality than just these two sides, and things are much more dynamic and fluid in his mentality than this dichotomy, but for the sake of discussion, this frame of reference is important. He is not as good as his school side displays, and not as cold as his Zero side displays, but these are exaggerated to serve a function. This much is clear both in his interactions with C2 and when he loses his memory, where he displays a personality that's akin to a hybrid of both sides. Lelouch is not a purely good person, nor an evil man. He's somewhere in between. Whether or not one side is truer to Lelouch's core self is up for debate, but for the sake of his goal, he knows that he must allow his Zero persona to dictate his actions, gaining more and more influence as he progresses forward. Zero is exactly what was needed, the ideal type of person to lead the revolution. However, compartmentalizing and shutting away an element of your personality is far from easy. Lelouch needs to be Zero, but the root of his school self shines through, and is both consciously and subconsciously a factor in his actions and behaviors. He pains, he hesitates, and his care for his loved ones tends to hinder his tactics. As much as he would like to make decisions with his head the entire time, the heart was always a big factor in his plans. Yet despite all of this, Lelouch eventually matured, steeled himself, and came to realize that destruction must come before creation, even if this destruction affected his loved ones. The ruthless and efficient Zero became the face of an uprising, and to the public, Zero was exactly what Lelouch needed him to be. Zero works as a symbol to fuel the Japanese and as a disguise to hide his true identity, but it is also just a darker, twisted, and overemphasized version of Lelouch. And the minute he puts his mask on, he forces himself to be overtaken by this. As postulated by Reddit user 17 Writers, Lelouch desires a change in the world, and Zero represents the unchained parts of Lelouch that can carry out this change. Becoming Zero is deliberate. It is the most conscious of choices, and slowly doing harsher and harsher things on the path to that change was always part of the plan. Of course, this didn't make it any easier when the difficult decisions come, but this demonstrates an important distinction. Lelouch does not lose his humanity in a power trip similar to someone like Walter White or Light Yagami. Instead, he sacrifices it and gives it away because it is what needs to be done for the greater good.
あらゆる破壊と喪失を。そう、創造の前には破壊が必要だ。そのために心が邪魔になるのなら消し去ってしまえばいい。そうだ。俺はもう進むしかない。だから。
Lelouch has shut himself off and resolved to be a person that he may not like, but who is still a part of him. The part that he needs to succeed, even if he doesn't want to fully cultivate that aspect of himself. This sacrifice is once again a show of his resolve, and lends great insight towards what his final plan, the Zero Requiem, truly meant for him. We'll discuss the Requiem later, but it is the ultimate demonstration of his intent. Lelouch sacrifices everything to have the world's malice focused on him, and for his global legacy to be one of an evil tyrant, only to be killed by his best friend. All for the sake of a better world. Some tend to interpret his willingness to die for the sake of the world as him scrambling for some redemption after being ashamed of his actions, but while his actions do bring him shame, he does not seek redemption through the Requiem, as we'll see in a little bit. What tends to be overlooked is that a death like this was something that Lelouch was prepared for since the beginning. Right in the very first episode, Lelouch says something significant.
どうした?撃たないのか?相手は学生だぞ。それとも気づいたか?撃っていいのは撃たれる覚悟があるやつだけだと。
Many interpret this as him addressing the men who were trying to kill him, but hindsight makes it clear that he was also referring to himself. This line encapsulates Lelouch's entire philosophy, and him saying it before his first killing, his first step on the path to his goal, is very telling. It's clear that from the start, he was willing to kill, and more importantly in this context, he was prepared to die, if need be. His plan had improvisation in the small situations, but the broad strokes of it were all deliberately laid out. It was not a desperate, disorganized struggle to the end. It was a methodical, arduous journey, one for which Lelouch was prepared to do evil to combat evil, and one where he was totally willing to die and spurn his legacy if it came to that. Lelouch was not a good person. He was a person that the world needed. He knew that pain would come to him, but by the end, he considers his own well-being to be unimportant. He acts, he takes agency, he struggles and falls, but he had the foresight to know that his humanity would slowly deteriorate, and this was all part of the plan to benefit the world. Now, this intent may not have been clear the entire way through, and selfishness definitely did rear up. Throughout the story, Lelouch does some incredibly dark things. He sacrifices innocence and jeopardizes his mission because of his own needs. But heroes are not always faultless. As I said, Lelouch is not a good man, and he is extremely flawed as a person, so naturally these flaws will be accentuated when he's in a position of such power. However, despite this, by the end he carries out an admirable plan. This is what prevents him from being completely villainous and makes him heroic, even if the extent of his heroism depends on interpretation. He is rightly viewed as a villain in-universe, but his final impact on the world tells a different story. Some will say that his terrible deeds were justified and par for the course, while others will say that killing is wrong in any context. The key point, though, is that Lelouch had noble intentions, and carried out those intentions for the benefit of the majority. He's not a knight in shining armor. He's a dark hero, a man who forced himself to become capable of doing the difficult, reprehensible things required to achieve change. Suzaku's story is one of darkness, about harboring admirable intentions, but losing oneself along the way to achieving one's goals. It's a character arc that contrasts with Lelouch's in almost every conceivable way, but there are two huge similarities between the pair from which these differences are made apparent. The first is that despite the initial disagreement when it came to method, both men originally sought to liberate the world from Britannia's tyrannical rule. And the second is that both slowly lose their light humanity as the story goes on, feeling the strain of their terrible deeds as they pile up. But while Lelouch is someone who, despite his difficulties, consciously sacrificed his humanity, Suzaku is the complete opposite, someone who unintentionally loses himself in his ideals due to hypocrisies and self-loathing. He had honorable enough intentions, but unlike Lelouch, he never really committed to carrying them out, and led himself astray due to selfish desire and sentiments that were meaningless in the context of war. He lacks a basic awareness because he never had the laser-sharp focus on his goals that Lelouch did, nor the realism that was required to realize how arduous a task changing a corrupt body of power from within is. Intentions can easily become clouded. Hindsight helps, but nothing can prepare you for the little things that can ever so slightly alter your path. Since these little things are subtle, only when you are far down your path do you realize how far you have strayed, because of how small these alterations seem in the moment. Lelouch sticks to his plan and values right until the end, while Suzaku loses focus of his goals and ends up being the type of person that he hated so much in the first place. It's a terrifying concept. Now, Suzaku's philosophy itself is a naive one in the context of this story. He believes that the means are more important than the end result. However, it's all too clear from the start that this ideology was doomed to fail. Suzaku is a sympathetic character, at least in structure, because he's a misguided soul, not an evil one. At heart, he really does want to change the world for the better, but this noble want is clouded by so much hypocrisy, a compensatory death wish, feelings of entitlement, survivor's guilt, and a sort of messiah complex that it never really properly manifests until the story's end, and ensures that Suzaku is far from the hero of this tale. Originally Japanese and son to Japan's last prime minister, Genbu Kururugi, Suzaku became an honorary Britannian soldier after forming his desire to change it from within. When he was a young boy, Britannia invaded, and in witnessing his father resisting until the bitter end for the sake of pride while his people died, Suzaku killed him to spare countless Japanese lives through assimilating with Britannia. After the death of his father, Suzaku grew to believe that rebellion and resistance were foolhardy, and only resulted in pointless death, and although he didn't approve of Britannia, he believed that he could change it from the inside into a much more just body of power. Although he thinks he did the right thing, he feels guilty about the incident and constantly places himself in dangerous positions because he subconsciously, and sometimes consciously, wishes to atone for his sins with death.
人を救いたいって？救われたいのは自分の心だろう。それに準じて死にたいんだよね。だからいつも自分を死に追い込む。思い出してしまったんです。え？自分は父を殺したんです。なのに罰せられることもなく、のうのうと生きている。そしてまたこうして守られて、殉職者やイレブンの人たちを横目に一人だけ。そんな自分にこんな資格は。
Not only this, but he longs for an honorable death due to wanting to escape from his guilt. However, when Lelouch uses his Geass to command his old friend to live on, Suzaku finds himself wanting to die, but unable to. Suzaku and Lelouch are of one mind in believing that Britannia is corrupt and must be stopped. However, Suzaku's desire to change it from within stems from wanting to show that his father died for a reason. It all comes back to his philosophy in the early parts of the show that states that achieving results with wrong methods means nothing. But his minor, peripheral endeavors grow in influence, and he eventually gets possessed by them. Rather than firming his resolve when it came to making Britannia a better kingdom, he became transfixed on his hubris and selfish goals. Suzaku is someone who is fixated on posturing, always trying to make it look like he is taking the moral high ground. As said earlier, his ideals were admirable, but they became warped due to his obsession of trying to be a better person than Zero. If we were to boil Suzaku's flaws down to one thing, it would be a lack of self-awareness. He genuinely tries to be good, but cannot bring himself to realize that the more he is concerned with looking good, the farther he gets from his goals and the closer he gets to becoming a reflection of the man that he hates. It's an inevitable, symmetrical little arc that is darkly poetic. To his credit, Suzaku is not an evil person. Even in the midst of his dark descent, he refuses to order the deaths of a million Black Knights due to both his respect for Nunnally's wishes and the fact that it's not in his nature. Similarly to Lelouch, Suzaku bears a thankless burden for this as well. However, unlike Lelouch, this is not a defining trait for Suzaku. While he does avoid full-out war and massacre, it's very telling that while those on Britannia's side view him as the White Knight, the Japanese nickname him as the White Reaper, and it's not hard to see why. By the latter parts of the story, he spares no thought for morals, despite his constant outward justifications for his actions. When Zero announces his plans to make the United States of Japan, Suzaku begins planning to become Britannia's Knight of One, to be a better focal point and symbol for the people than Zero. It's likely here that Suzaku is not purely doing this because he thinks it would benefit the people and the world, but because he wants to win against Zero. After he cannot ignore the mass bloodshed he has spread, he sheds all notion of his honor. He stops trying to fool anyone, and resolves to reach his goals using any means, Notably, he becomes the very ideological concept that he hated Zero for in the first place.
これまでの自分は甘かった。
あ、そう。
結果より手段と言いながら自分が大事にしていたのは理想や美学だったのではないかと。必要なものは結果だ。
Suzaku holds two philosophies. The first adheres to the idea that a positive end result does not matter if the path to that result is immoral, but eventually he shifts his views so that he and Lelouch both believe that the ends justify the means. However, his journey towards shifting ideals has quite a bit more substance to it than people give it credit for. Suzaku's massive guilt and constant death wish show that he is a self-loathing person. He hates himself, and a primary reason for this is because of the way that he murdered his father. This aspect of him is the foundation point for how his philosophy develops throughout the show. In the immediate aftermath of his patricide, Suzaku realized that this was the right thing to do because of how many lives the act spared. As such, a seed was planted in his mind that advocated for utilitarianism. But because of how horrified he was at his actions, any emotion or thought attached to the murder that even remotely held it in positive regard, other than the surface level idea that he saved a lot of people, was suppressed. Suzaku knew what he did was wrong, so he did not feel right in accepting that any part of this act was okay. Because he was so obsessed with being morally righteous, he overburdened himself with a death wish, massive guilt, and most significantly, false ideals. Deep down, maybe even subconsciously, Suzaku felt that killing his father was right in the grand scheme of things. But because he knew that it was wrong morally, he rejected his feelings. And so, he built up a new philosophy, one that completely opposed his true thoughts, to form some sense of internal balance. What is at work here is a psychological defense mechanism called reaction formation, in which a person represses their true feelings which they find to be unacceptable, and instead express those feelings in a contrasting form. It's a way to hide from the truth about oneself.
信じてるの？8年前の自分なんて。
So maybe Suzaku despises Zero so much, not just because of the terrible things that he does, but because he is a walking reflection of the part of himself that he hates. Suzaku was terrified so much by his true feelings that he built a false, opposing philosophy around them, with the truth repressed and buried deep within his mind. When he finally honed up to who he had become, he confronted the fact that he didn't care what he had to do to reach his goals as long as he met them. This is when the philosophy that was established all those years ago finally properly showed itself. Now that he had tossed away the lies that he had been telling himself, the seed had sprouted, and he was fully exposed to his flaws for the first time in his life, which eventually led to his attempts to properly atone. So while Suzaku did become the very thing that he hated, from a certain point of view, you could say that it was who he was all along, and that it was just buried underneath insecurities, fear, and avoidance. Perhaps he was more similar to Zero than he originally thought, and his fixation on trying to be morally superior to him was his way of compensating for the shame that this caused him. By the end, however, this all fades away, and Suzaku is left to deal with who he is and what he's done. His story is one that deceptively focuses on self-acceptance. Suzaku was someone who truly wanted what was best for the world, but good intentions remain intentions if they aren't carried out properly. He postured with fancy ideals, trying to feel superior and trying to be self-righteous, and this pushed him off the edge. But Suzaku comes to the realization that he had gone too far and lost sight of his goal in his darkness. He realizes that the constant war would have to be broken by something to bring prosperity to the land, and he turns his attention back to a peaceful future. By the end, it's clear that he realized his mistake, and he does virtually the only thing that he could have done to make strides to atone. He loses his identity and becomes Zero, a symbol of peace. A symbol that will endure, thanks to Lelouch's command to live. In my eyes, Lelouch was the hero of the story, but Suzaku represented something just as important. There's a reason that Suzaku is so hated. He is what happens when you lose sight of yourself, a deep-rooted fear in modern society, a concept that is naturally repulsive. If Lelouch showed what could happen when man sticks to their convictions, Suzaku shows even more humanity by displaying what we fear our intentions will lead to, and there is profound value in that message.
この世界には 善意から生まれる悪意がある。悪意から生まれる善意がある。
As said earlier, Lelouch and Suzaku share the common trait of being individuals that wanted to change the world, and ones that, through their means of doing so, commit terrible deeds. But the two branch off from each other from that foundation point, and oppose one another in almost every conceivable way. There is much more of a reflection and asymmetry to the two than the obvious contrast in philosophy early on. At a base level, Suzaku spent the majority of the story doing things that stemmed from selfish motives that he tried to hide behind a front of morals. Meanwhile, Lelouch did the total opposite, selfish motives with the goal of making himself seem amoral. Lelouch was never one concerned about trying to have the moral high ground, as much as he was about doing what he believed was right by the end. But Suzaku drove himself further and further down the path of darkness by trying to make himself seem better, to both himself and others. Lelouch stays consistent with his values throughout the show, and Suzaku loses himself. Lelouch does what needs to be done with no thoughts of trying to be righteous. Suzaku does his best to look good and follow meaningless abstract notions that he calls ideals, which hold no weight because he doesn't adhere to them and practice what he preaches. There's an almost lyrical mirror image at work here. However, the most important point here when considering the conclusion of the show is that Lelouch consciously sacrificed his sense of self while Suzaku unintentionally lost track of his. And there is a note of irony behind the interesting dynamics of the two best friends. Lelouch's kind move to command Suzaku to live is unintentionally cruel given Suzaku's death wish, though he eventually shifts the intent of it to give Suzaku the freedom and atonement that he had been seeking his entire life. This element dovetails with how the two men lose their light humanity to make the Zero Requiem the most appropriate ending possible for these two characters. The Zero Requiem is the final narrative beat of the show, occurring after Lelouch and Suzaku realized that their goal could only be achieved through cooperation. In an act that was essentially Lelouch's suicide, Suzaku fakes his death in an earlier battle with Colin, while Lelouch rises to power and proves himself to be a true tyrant to the world. In recaptured Japan, Lelouch is paraded through the streets as the nation's leader, until Suzaku appears under the mask of Zero and assassinates his old friend, much to the joy of the populace. It is revealed that Lelouch told Suzaku that in doing this, he must sacrifice himself, renounce his old identity, and take up the mantle of Zero, a faceless man with the sole focus of securing the world's peaceful future. People band and unite under symbols, so naturally they can band and unite against symbols. And in killing Lelouch, the man who the world is now unified in hatred against, the nation will unite after blaming all of the evil deeds of the past on him. The Zero Requiem led to more focus on benefiting the world rather than war, and in turn, Lelouch's dream for world peace was achieved. I won't be going into the specifics of the plan or whether or not the aftermath was believable, because that isn't pertinent to the discussion at hand. Instead, with much help and thanks once again from 17 writers, I'll focus on what this event meant for Lelouch and Suzaku, and how it was extremely effective in concluding their respective arcs through displaying who they truly were at the deepest level. The Zero Requiem, its implications, and Suzaku's role in it are the ultimate display of kindness and love from Lelouch towards his best friend. It is both exactly what the world needed and what Suzaku needed, and the only benefit or selfish element it had for Lelouch is that this was the final step of his grand plan, an affirmation of his original goal. The Zero Requiem is not and has never been Lelouch's redemption. It was Suzaku's. Lelouch seeks no redemption. He is what he needed to be, a symbol of hate to unite the world. He never wanted redemption, and from the very beginning he knew that his role in this revolution for peace would be a thankless one that would likely lead to his death. His best friend, however, through this act, is ironically given the ultimate means for redemption. Some would say, the ideal gift. While Suzaku originally thought that death was the ultimate punishment and the suitable consequence for his actions, Lelouch's final words change his whole perspective.
これはお前にとっても罰だ。
Suzaku seeks to be punished. This is his punishment. He seeks to atone for everything he has done. That may not be possible, but this is the closest he can ever get to righting his wrongs. He still maintains his original goal of making the world a better, more peaceful place. This is the way to do it. Through the Zero Requiem, Suzaku dismisses redundancies and achieves what he always wanted so deeply. This is his salvation. And at the same time, Lelouch carries out what he had been intending to do. He creates the world anew. It doesn't matter that he's universally hated, because as always, the results are what matter, not the path to getting there. Though he understandably wavered on this throughout the story, he has always stuck to his philosophy. This is why the Requiem is not a redemption for Lelouch, but just a confirmation of his plan succeeding. The redemption is for Suzaku. One man dies as a pincushion for all of the malice in the world for the sake of his desired better future, and one forsakes his identity and ideals to live out the remainder of his days atoning for his sins, yet is fulfilled by this. Both achieve their original goal, and through this, some twisted sense of balance and harmony is struck between these two characters, and the narrative as a whole.